Well, hello, everybody. This is Andrew Tucker here from Thinc, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, a European-based legal network of lawyers seeking to challenge the delegitimization of Israel, to look at the whole issue of how international law applies to Israel, to the Middle East generally. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there. And we feel that there's a little bit of bias out there. We feel that Israel, while definitely not perfect, and there are issues around the conflict with the Palestinians and so forth, international law, at least in the UN context, perhaps even in the EU context, tends to be used from one side only. So we want to take a fresh look. And to do that today, we're very honored to have Professor Jeff Korn from Texas Tech University School of Law, all the way from Lubbock in Texas. Jeff, it's an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Jeff, you are an expert in international humanitarian law, international criminal law, the law of war. I want you to help us unpack for our viewers, who are very diverse in many different countries, but many of our viewers do not have a real understanding of how law works.
Yeah.
There is a perception, and I think there will be more and more perception as this conflict goes on, that Israel is the dominant force. It's using excessive force. We're going to probably see a big ground offensive against Gaza coming in the coming days. There's going to be a lot of civilian victims. So if you would share with us, just give us a grip on how the legal system works. So let's just think of, what is this conflict to start with? Who are the parties to the conflict, and how does international law help us identify them?
So the law of state self-defense is where we start. States have a right to take necessary and proportional measures to defend themselves against imminent or actual armed attacks. And that is defined in the United Nations Charter as an inherent right, suggesting that it doesn't come from the treaty. It comes from your status as a state. One of the debates that had occurred about a decade ago or 2 decades ago was whether that right could be invoked in response to actions of a non-state opponent. And certainly after 9/11, the United States took the position that, yes, a non-state armed group can be responsible for an unlawful armed attack. And there was some controversy at the International Court of Justice over this. But I think that train has left the station. I think most nations in the world were quick to acknowledge that the gravity of the violence inflicted on Israel justified Israel in taking measures in self-defense. Then comes the next question. What is a necessary and proportionate response? And here's where the first kind of aspect of distortion occurs, because there are many people who have this attitude that self-defense is kind of like a tit-for-tat equation. If they shoot a missile, you can shoot a missile. If they kill a soldier, you can kill. That's simply erroneous. To understand the right of self-defense, you just have to think of the state as an individual and community. If you were walking down the street and someone threatened to kill you, you would have a right to take necessary measures, not just to stop the immediate threat, but to restore your security, which means Israel has a right to do all those things that are necessary to ensure itself that it will not continue to be the victim of unlawful attacks emanating from Gaza, orchestrated by Hamas. You're going to hear a lot about proportionality, right? But proportionality, again, is not, you don't analyze proportionality by saying, well, Hamas killed 1,000 civilians, so once you get past 1,000 casualties in Gaza, it must be a disproportionate response. That's erroneous. Proportionality is threat dictated. Israel has an obligation to make a good faith assessment of what measures are necessary to disable and neuter the threat that Hamas poses out of Gaza. And if anything, in the past conflicts, 2014, I think 2019, the flare-ups, in my view, has been Israel would have been legally justified to take much more aggressive and much broader military action against Hamas. They made a political decision and a diplomatic decision that they would tolerate the presence of this ongoing threat on their border because they had a sense of security. That sense of security has been negated by the capabilities of Hamas, which, by the way, in and of itself rebuts the false narrative that Israel has Gaza as like a prison. Because I don't know a prison where you could get all this weaponry in, right? The mere fact that the Hamas has this capability, this ability to barrage Israel with enough rockets that it overwhelms Iron Dome, that in and of itself tells us that Gaza is not under Israeli occupation and hasn't been for a long time. But that's a footnote. So don't fall into the trap of analyzing the right of self-defense by simply doing a casualty count on one side or the other, or saying there's a tit-for-tat equation. Ask yourself, if you were the country that had this ongoing threat on its border, what measures would your military be justified in taking to restore your sense of security against unlawful attacks? You look like you want to ask a question.
Yeah. So we're talking about a threat and we're talking about a response to a threat. How does Israel assess what the nature of the threat is? Okay, there was an immediate cause. There was an immediate attack. A lot of people were killed and massacred. That's horrible. But Israel's response is not just to those killing of those individuals. It's responding to a deeper sense of threat, isn't it? What is that threat? How does Israel characterize it under international law?
I mean, that's a challenge for any nation invoking the right of self-defense, is that they have to make an assessment based on the best available information they have as to what is really necessary to restore the sense, the reality, not just the sense, but the reality of national security. I think that in this situation, it's very clear that Israel has a legitimate perception and conclusion that it's the organization of Hamas itself, that Hamas is a belligerent armed organization. And there are really three elements to neutering it. One is to decapitate its command and control, right? So you identify the command and control nodes, individuals, and capabilities, and you go after them. Another is to obviously destroy its combat capability. So you're looking for the actual operatives, the launch sites, the equipment. And the third is to deprive it of reconstitution, to prevent it from reconstituting its arsenal, which means you can take reasonable measures to prevent its sponsor, its principal sponsor, who we know is Iran, from reinforcing and reconstituting. Because you can take away all of the missiles, you can take away all of the ammunition, but if you leave the armed group organized, existing, and you don't interdict its ability to reconstitute, and it's determined, you're just delaying the inevitable in the future, which they've done it before. And again, I think in the past, they would have been justified for taking much broader self-defense measures. They chose not to. It was a calculated risk. The risk didn't pay off. And I think now they are going to identify what this is what military people do. Political leaders give them the mission. The mission is to restore our sense of the reality of national security. The generals then translate that into operational objectives. What are the operational objectives to achieve the strategic end state? So if the strategic end state is to make sure that Hamas cannot threaten Israel in the future, the operational objectives are, here are the things we have to identify, destroy, disable, interdict.
Okay, so a couple of questions come to my mind. Well, one is Hamas is not only located in the Gaza Strip, it's also located in the West Bank, elsewhere. And secondly, the command and control is that that takes us into a whole new area about Hamas's relationship with Iran and who is really giving the orders.
The very complicated question that brings together an intersection of international law, diplomacy, and politics. Okay. So there are some great thinkers who've looked at the pattern of Iranian behavior relying on proxy forces, Hezbollah and Hamas principally, but Syrians as well now, and have argued, I think persuasively, that there is an ongoing kind of low-level simmering conflict between Iran and Israel, arguably between Iran and the United States as well, and Saudi Arabia. And if that's the case, then the actions of the proxy, i.e. Hamas, could legitimately be attributed to the state of Iran, and it would be Iran that would be responsible for the aggressive armed attack against Israel. That would justify self-defense measures against Iran. I personally believe that Israel would be justified in making that claim right now. But that doesn't mean they think it's a good idea to do it. And I think what's going to happen vis-a-vis Iran is going to be a continuation of what my great friend, Brigadier General Ken Watkin from Canada, has characterized as the shadow war. This is a shadow war. This is a war using clandestine, covert operations, below the threshold measures. That's going to continue. It may ramp up. But I think it's unlikely that Israel is at a point where it wants to overtly claim that this is part of a broader armed conflict with Iran, just as the United States was hesitant to do it. I mean, I was telling you before we came on that when the United States launched the drone attack that killed General Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, or the IGRC, IRGC, there was a lot of debate over whether it was a legitimate exercise of self-defense. And I took the position, maybe we don't need a self-defense justification, because if we're in an ongoing war with Iran, all we have to do is determine he's a lawful target and he's a commanding general. That's an easy determination. But diplomatically and politically, we know there's huge, huge second and third order consequences. I mean, just think politically, if the Israeli government were to come out and say this was an attack by Iran, then there would be a public demand for swift, aggressive, decisive action in response. I'm not sure they're there yet.
Right. Okay, so we're looking on the self-defense side of things, that's international humanitarian law, right? Which prescribes the limits on the use of force to respond to a threat.
Well, I mean, I think I would characterize that as the legal basis for the use of force. I mean, I think there are two layers when we talk about humanitarian law. We're not talking about why you fight. We're talking about how you fight.
Right.
So the why is based on the right of self-defense, the United Nations Charter, limits on when a state is allowed to resort to force to protect itself. Once you're in the conflict, the how is dictated by international humanitarian law, which is a synonym for the law of war.
Okay. So this is the Latin phrase, jus ad bellum and jus in bello, is that
exactly.
Right?
Ad bellum is why you fight. In bello is how you fight.
Right. Okay. But so this is all focused on what Israel can do in response. What about on the other side? What are the legal liabilities? I mean, what about Hamas? Can Hamas just go around the world? What is international law? What are the levers? What are the tools?
Well, before we get to the tools, let's lay a basic foundation.
Okay.
One of the most significant principles of international law related to the jus belli, the law related to war, is that why you fight has no relevance to the rules that apply to how you fight. In other words, you're not allowed to say, because I'm fighting against illegal occupation, I don't have to follow the rules of war, or because I'm acting in self-defense against an illegal armed attack, I don't have to follow the rules of war. This is called equality of application of humanitarian law. Once you're in a conflict, all parties to that conflict are equally bound by the rules of war. Okay, so one of the great distortions in this situation is the conflation between the why and the how. So there are people, we know this, and I can understand it, who believe that the Palestinian people have been under oppressive occupation. They have a right to self-determination, and the next step is they have a right of resistance to the occupation. Okay, maybe that's true. I don't necessarily believe that, but let's assume for argument's sake it's true. That doesn't mean that when they resist, they're allowed to ignore the basic rules of war. They have to follow them. And the singular, most basic rule of war is that you are always prohibited from deliberately and intentionally launching attacks directed against the civilians, the civilian population generally. You have to distinguish between legitimate military targets and all other persons, places, and things. So, as I told you before we came on, for me, there's a very simple premise here. One party to this conflict is trying to kill civilians. The other party is trying not to kill civilians. There is no moral equivalency in the way this conduct is being conducted, the manner in which it's being conducted. And that has nothing to do with why the parties are fighting. And so this is why it is so distorting to count casualties, to look at the number of buildings destroyed. Because the question we need to be asking is not, was a building destroyed? The question is, was the attack on that building intended to destroy civilian property or a military target that was embedded in that building, or military personnel that were in that building? And did the party launching the attack do all that was feasible, which is an operational concept, things I can do that don't compromise my military advantage, to mitigate the risk to the civilian population? And when we start analyzing it that way, what we see is Hamas that's deliberately launching indiscriminate attacks, deliberately attacking civilians and civilian property. Now, sometimes they achieve their goal and sometimes they don't. But on the other side, you have forces that are attacking legitimate targets, trying to mitigate civilian casualties. And in most cases, their ability to mitigate those casualties is compromised. Why? Because they're fighting an enemy that's deliberately putting its targets in the midst of the civilian population. In my view, not just to get a shielding effect. I think Hamas wants the Israelis to have to kill civilians because that contributes to their ultimate objective, which is an information narrative and not an operational result. Because the difference between the IDF and Hamas is that information operations in the IDF are a supporting effort to combat. But for Hamas, combat is a supporting effort to their information campaign. They want destruction. They want civilian casualties. If Egypt were to open up safe areas on the Egyptian side of the border and say, we want all women, children, elderly, pregnant, Hamas wouldn't let them go.
So how does that information narrative that they're creating, how does that help their long-term objective of destroying Israel?
Well, what it does is it delegitimizes, it isolates Israel. That's number one. But the much more important strategic consequence is that the pressure starts to build on Israel to turn off the levers, to pull back.
Who can apply that pressure?
Well, I mean, the main source of that pressure would be the United States and the EU.
Yeah.
Because Israel knows that, I mean, look, if Israel's existence were in jeopardy and the EU and the United States said don't act, I don't think Israel would necessarily be stopped by that. But short of that, they know that the risk of alienating, right? The type of support that that's already been voiced, for example, yesterday's comments by President Biden, that was unequivocal support for Israel. But they know that there are members of Congress that are skeptical of Israeli policies and the dysfunction that we have in Washington. And historically, governments in the EU have been responsive to a public sentiment that we'll just say is very critical of the human carnage that's inflicted, that this kind of David and Goliath myth that Israel is this all-powerful cyborg and they're so every time Hamas can create an incident where it appears that the IDF is indifferent to Palestinian civilian suffering, it contributes to those levers being pulled that will start to put pressure on Israel to taper back. And what does that do? That leaves Hamas standing when the dust settles. And for them, that's victory. Their victory is, hey, we're still here. You couldn't get rid of us. As when we know that, because this is what happened in prior conflicts. They don't care about the carnage. That's the price that they inflict on the Palestinian people to achieve their strategic end state.
And this is deliberate in your view.
I think it's absolutely calculated. And as a matter of fact, I've written an article, wrote an article about 2 years ago called Indirect Civilian Targeting. And the whole premise of that article was that what groups like Hamas do is more aggravated than human shielding. Human shielding is a war crime. That's when you use a civilian in an attempt to prevent the enemy from attacking your target. I think Hamas uses its operations to bait the Israelis into attacking the target because they want the Israelis to kill civilians. So that raises a question. Who should be accountable for that? The pilot who drops the bomb, or the enemy who creates a condition that he's essentially using the attacking pilot as his innocent instrumentality to kill civilians? I think it's completely calculated.
So they're playing the international system, the diplomatic, political, and legal system to create this atmosphere, placing more and more pressure on Israel, in the hope that one day Israel will be kind of completely delegitimized on the world stage, like
BDS,
South Africa, or
I mean, look at of course, look at the BDS movement. They're an evil country. Look at what they do to the Palestinians. We're going to isolate them. We're going to. I mean, is it a feasible strategic objective in the long run? I think not. But does it hurt? Does it hurt Israel? Does it compromise its ability to defend itself? Does it impose political and diplomatic limits on the exercise of? Look, there's no question. Do the multiplier, right? There are 350 million Americans, more or less, about 7 or 8 million Israelis. Israelis have lost, let's say, 1,000 casualties in a 24-hour period. So 1,000 for 7 million would be what? 50,000 for a country of 350 million? Can you imagine the American response if an attack by a non-state group inflicted 50,000 casualties in one incident?
Yeah.
I mean, and not just the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Netherlands, I don't care. Any country that suffered this gravity of harm. And by the way, it's not as if Hamas was just attacking military bases, capturing military personnel. If they'd have done that, it would have been sad. But at least you could say, what? They're following the rules. They're attacking military targets. No. Their methods of warfare are deliberately barbaric. And that's the fundamental moral difference between the two parties to this conflict.
So let's move to the hostages then. They have, 150 or so people. I'm not sure if we even know the numbers.
Yep.
Israelis and other nationalities. They've deliberately taken them into the territories of Gaza, using them, threatening to kill them, and they're doing all kinds. I heard today they're even using their credit cards and horrible things, using their phones to send.
Yep.
How does that work out and play out in international legal terms? First of all, is there criminal liability? Can we talk in terms of criminal liability under international?
Well, look, the notion of being a combatant means that you act with the privilege of international law to participate in hostilities. To be a lawful combatant, to have that privilege, ever since 1899, international treaties have said you have to operate under responsible command and be part of an organization that respects the laws and customs of war. The expectation is that the state or even the non-state group that fields you, that puts you into battle, bears a responsibility to hold you accountable when you commit serious violations of the law. That's the notion of discipline. There is no expectation that Hamas is going to be even slightly concerned with imposing accountability for war crimes committed by its own personnel, because it's a systemic, calculated, institutional method of warfare. So there'll be people who say, well, the Israelis are not particularly aggressive at prosecuting their own war criminals, but they do it periodically. They investigate. They have a system that's designed to impose accountability, unlike their opponent. So that begs the question, is there any basis, any way that individuals responsible for ordering these barbaric tactics could be held accountable? Well, there are basically going to be three potential methods. One would be Israel captures some of these individuals and tries them in its own courts for crimes committed against Israeli citizens, other citizens, and war crimes generally. And Israel would have a legitimate claim to exercise jurisdiction, just like we prosecute people in the United States who commit war crimes. That would be number one. Number two, in the future, if somebody accountable or responsible for these atrocities were to end up in the jurisdiction of another country, these are such serious violations that other countries would likely be able to invoke their what are called universal jurisdiction statutes. So, for example, the United States has a War Crimes Act that allows us to prosecute any person found in the United States responsible for committing certain serious war crimes. And then, of course, there's the thing that everybody talks about, the International Criminal Court. Yeah. And here's a little irony. As you noted when we started, Israel is not a party to the International Criminal Court, but the Palestinian Authority has requested and received recognition by the International Criminal Court as a party to the court. That means that the ICC prosecutor has jurisdiction over any crimes in violation of the court's criminal statute that occur in Palestinian territory. Guess what? The ICC prosecutor could charge individual members of Hamas and their leaders with a range of crimes: hostage taking, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, murder and summary execution, use of civilians as human shields. Those four right there, easy. There, sometimes you look at the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, and was an attack on this target a war crime, and there are, it's complicated because we have to know what the Russians thought they were attacking, and this is not complicated. This is what lawyers call res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. You cannot conceive of more obvious, blatant war crimes than what Hamas has and continues to commit. And if the ICC prosecutor is really interested in credibility, considering the fact that they've been investigating Israeli activity in the West Bank for a long time, they need to immediately set the gears in motion to start an investigation and, in my view, an indictment of senior Hamas commanders and Hamas operatives responsible for these heinous war crimes.
By the way, I don't think I've seen the prosecutor say anything yet. Often, no, interesting.
By the way, I don't think Israel has any expectation that would happen, right? And so, one of the potential consequences of a ground incursion into Gaza is actually capturing individuals and putting them on trial in Israel and holding them accountable under Israeli law for the gross violations of international law that they committed, not to mention the violations of Israeli domestic law that they committed on Israeli territory, murder, kidnapping. I mean, if some group comes into the territory of the Netherlands or Denmark and murders people, you don't have to charge that as a war crime. That's just murder.
Yeah. 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 Okay, one last question, Jeff. There's so much to talk about. Israel has cut off electricity into the Gaza Strip. Some people are jumping up and down and saying this is an illegal siege of Gaza. Israel has a responsibility to look after the citizens. Is Israel breaching international law here?
I don't think at this point we could say that. First off, siege is not prohibited by international law. I would encourage everybody, if you're interested in this, Google the name Sean Watts, S-E-A-N, Watts, W-A-T-T-S, and siege warfare. He wrote an excellent commentary on this for the Articles of War blog at the Lieber Center at West Point about 2 years ago or a year ago in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. And he lays out the international law related to siege. During a siege, you have to make an effort. You have to do what's feasible to spare institutions of religion, education, humanitarian action, obviously. And you are prohibited. This is no question. You're prohibited from using starvation as a method of warfare against the civilian population. You are not prohibited from starving the enemy. And you are not required to provide the enemy resources that it's going to use in its war effort against you. So think of it like this. If there were one power generation facility in Gaza, just one, and I were a military commander and that power was being used to build rockets, launch rockets, effectuate command and control communications, use radars, all the things you use electricity for, would that qualify as a lawful or a legitimate target? Unquestionably, yes. Now, if you are going to conduct an attack on something or cut off resources in order to deprive the enemy of them, you have to consider the principle of proportionality. You have to consider whether the impact on the civilian population will be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage. Cutting off electricity to an enemy when you're preparing to conduct a ground offensive into an urban environment that it has prepared defenses in is an incredibly high value military advantage. So the Israelis have to consider the consequence for the civilian population, but that doesn't mean that a negative consequence makes it illegal. The other piece of this is the Israelis do have an obligation to refrain from arbitrarily depriving access to humanitarian assistance to the civilian population. They have to make good faith efforts to facilitate the passage of humanitarian assistance, the provision of humanitarian assistance. They can monitor it. They can make sure that they can take measures in an effort to make sure it's not being diverted to military operatives. But candidly, I don't think that's going to be a significant issue because it would be strategically foolish for the Israeli military to completely prevent any type of humanitarian access to Gaza, because even if it's legal, the perception that you're not just starving the enemy, you're starving the civilian population is ultimately going to have an adverse strategic consequence. So I think there's probably very robust and detailed coordination going on between the IDF and the United Nations, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders. How are we going to enable you to get in there behind us and mitigate the suffering of the civilian population in a way that doesn't compromise our military advantage? That's their obligation. And I will tell you, if they're not thinking about that, if they're not planning for that, then they're making a catastrophic mistake and arguably violating their legal obligation.
Well, presumably they are. I mean, I haven't followed it, but that would, yeah. Does the Red Cross, by the way, have an obligation to take action in relation to the hostages?
Well, they haven't. You don't have to call it an obligation. The Red Cross, that is the essence of their mission. I promise you that they're doing everything within their power to interact with Hamas and try and get access to these hostages to make sure that Hamas is respecting what's called Common Article 3 of the 4 Geneva Conventions, which is the basic obligation of humane treatment of detainees. Whether Hamas is going to give them access, I don't know. But hats off to the International Committee of the Red Cross, particularly their field operatives. They take immense risk when they go into conflict zones, especially when they're interacting with non-state actors. They do it without hesitation, courageously. Their goal is neutral. They don't care why people are fighting. They don't care which side is good or bad. They care only about that one thing, and that is ameliorating the suffering of war victims. So we know that they're using all the methods they have to get access to these individuals. Now, once they get access to them, we're not going to hear about that, because that's part of the way you get access. It's a confidential dialogue. And by the way, when Israel starts capturing Palestinians, it's going to be the same thing. They're going to want to see how they're being treated, monitor respect for the law. The difference is, the Israelis are going to give them that access. I don't think Hamas will.
So let's just close off on that. I mean, it just seems to me there's something kind of absurd about all of this. We have a legal system which just kind of presupposes that the parties and the players within that system respect the rules of the game, don't they? It's all based on kind of concepts of humane behavior and we're talking about people and institutions and major state and non-state actors, which they don't care.
Yeah, but
I'm
going to push back a little bit on that. Okay. I think that ideally that's how the system is conceived. But realistically, we know historically that there is a low expectation that everybody's going to follow the rules completely. So this begs the question, why do we care? If we're fighting an enemy that doesn't follow the rules, why should we care about them? Well, there are so many answers to that question. First off, as the great Telford Taylor said once, there's a good reason why we should embrace the law of war, because it works more often than it fails, right? So even when countries have or groups have blatantly violated the rule of humane treatment, in many cases, the person that suffered that abuse survived the ordeal to tell the story. Think of John McCain. The North Vietnamese didn't comply with their obligations under the Prisoner of War Convention, which was why he could never raise his arms up above this level, because they both were broken when he ejected from his plane and he didn't get adequate medical care. But they didn't kill him. He lived. And I would say part of that is because, as you go down, at some point, maybe the law is having a salutary effect. That's number one. Number two, and this is very, very important. It's easy for people like me and you from a distance to say something like, well, the Israelis should use the same tactics that the enemy uses. But you're not the soldier that has to use those tactics. You're not the commander that has to order them. It's not your son or daughter who's being asked to deliberately kill a civilian. People who fight wars have to live with the consequence of their actions, for ideally, if they survive, for the rest of their lives. And the line between moral and immoral conduct in war is drawn by the law of war. So we have the law serves a purpose of preserving a sense of moral integrity, particularly when you come from a society that believes in morality. So yeah, it's asymmetric. You should expect that your enemy is barbaric, but that should not be, don't be tempted to go down to that level, because it will corrode the moral integrity of the young men and women you're putting into battle. The law gives them all the authority they need to use aggressive, deadly combat power to bring the enemy into submission. But these bright lines do everything you can to mitigate the risk to the innocent have to be preserved. So it's not just a system of reciprocity. That's the ideal. But even when that fails, there's great value, particularly if you're in a professional armed force fighting for a democracy, to demand that your commanders demand of their subordinates respect for these fundamental rules, because that's why we fight. And if we abandon them, we're no better than the enemy we're fighting.
And Israel, if I'm not mistaken, is widely known to be one of the highest. Again, I'm sure mistakes are made, but Israel makes an enormous attempt to comply with the rules of law.
Categorical, yes. And this is the sadness of distorted narratives of whether they're respecting law. When you see people, they say, well, look at all the destruction. They must be all war criminals. That's not how the law works. And it's and I remember doing a presentation in Geneva through the Jewish Institute of National Security for America. And I was sitting at a table at a dinner, and some woman said to me, why do you do this? Like, nobody cares. You're defending Israel at the UN Human Rights Commission. They all hate Israel. And I thought for a minute, and I said, you know what? If one soldier, one lieutenant who found himself in the brutality of Gaza, in the dirt and the blood and the mud, and followed the rules at great personal risk, here's my presentation, then I've done something good. If I validated that soldier's commitment to these bright lines, then that is a positive, even if nobody in the Human Rights Commission pays any attention to me. And I think we have to remember that. In many ways, people will say this debate, the views on Israel and what's happening are so binary that you're wasting your time arguing. We're not wasting our time. There is still a group of people at the margin that can be influenced. But even without that, let's remind the young Israelis and the commanders they are operating under that we see what they're doing, that we understand what they're doing, and that we admire and respect their devotion to rules that their enemy could care less about.
Geoff, thank you so much. You've been amazing giving us insight into these things. So thank you so much. We have to draw it to a close. I look forward to speaking to you again further on these issues. Thank you so much.
That's Geoff
Thank you.
Bye.